Welcome to What's Up, Doc, a look inside the warehousing world, brought to you by Opendock. In this show, we chat with people making the supply chain happen and about the latest subjects in the world of logistics, warehouse management, and technology. Bring the forklift because this episode ships out in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to the What's Up Doc podcast. It's Jeff and Calissa again with a new guest, Tom Robotham from Opendock, which I had to get corrected on several times to make sure I said it right, so I'm practicing here. And Tom's the head of logistics with some great experience in the past with places like Polaris, and now he's in the plumbing world. He has experience in the bedding world. So basically every kind of supply chain you could think of. We're excited to have him. Tom, what did I miss about your background and your experience that you're going to shed some light on the world for us today?
Well, I think you hit the at least the most recent points, but I think also, not only am I the head of logistics, but I also run the entire supply chain for Opendock North America. And so it's not just the logistics piece of the puzzle. Obviously, that's what we're focusing on today, but having to deal with all the other supply chain issues as well on top of that. So kind of compounded my challenges. But yeah, I have done a lot of different businesses and operations over the years, but this has been the most dynamic and frankly crazy time I've ever seen in my entire career. So it's certainly been a big challenge. But yeah, I've been with Opendock for almost 5 years in October, and so it's been a wild ride.
And so Opendock is not a household name. What does Opendock do? What's the core functionality, and then what's the role of logistics in Opendock?
Sure. So Opendock is a Finnish-based company, and we make PEX pipe, so polyethylene pipe for the plumbing industry, both commercial and residential. We also make fittings and other systems that go around plumbing, and frankly also with home comfort. So we make radiant floor heating and radiant floor heating products globally. So Opendock is about $1.3 billion, has been traded on the Finnish NASDAQ. So it is a publicly traded company in Finland. But we've been in this business for well over 100 years, making plumbing and various products. We've been in this country for about 30 plus years, making this PEX product and bringing it into the market.
I just love figuring about companies like Opendock that they're not household names, right? And then it's just because we don't understand or see that brand listed anywhere, and it's $1 billion company, and you put one of the most critical piece of infrastructure in our plumbing out there. And it's amazing just to learn about them. Like, we don't know them as household names. So it's really cool to hear about it.
Well, a lot of homeowners don't go tooling around inside their walls and seeing what kind of pipe is in there, right? So it's not a well-known household brand, but it is certainly well-known in the plumbing industry. We're the best in class in what we do. And so plumbers know us very well, and homeowners get the benefit, even though they don't necessarily know the name.
That's great. So logistics at a company like Opendock, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so we actually distribute from one central distribution center in the U.S. We have 2 in Canada, and so our biggest customers are really the wholesalers that sell into the plumbing trades. So we're really a professional plumbers brand and product, because we don't sell into DIY channels at all. So this is really tailored to and pushed towards professional plumbers in the trade. So yeah, logistics is huge for us because we're shipping to a wide group of wholesalers, from very small mom and pops that are a couple of people, all the way up to some of the largest wholesalers in the country, and everything in between. So obviously we have to have a very wide flexible fleet to satisfy all those different demands, from very large orders of truckloads and multiple truckloads down to less than truckload shipments that are going to, a huge number of various destinations inside the U.S. and Canada. So it becomes very, very important for us to have a strong channel and strong partners to get those deliveries where they need to be.
Yeah, I know Tom had mentioned, how the supply chain had really been, it started struggling with COVID initially, but it really hasn't bounced back quite yet. And so I was curious about how do you de-risk that, or how do you come up with like a contingency plan to kind of help, um, you know, demystify everything that's going on and help everyone understand like why some of their supplies will be delayed.
Sure. Well, I think,
Could you talk to us a little bit more about that,
yeah,
Tom?
twofold for us, right? So COVID did have an impact on us. Obviously, we were like a lot of construction companies that make construction products. We were, a necessary business, so we had to run. We ran throughout the pandemic, but we also had to stay close to our suppliers because obviously they were in various industries, and so we had to make sure they weren't suffering from COVID with actually loss of people or loss of supply. And then for us also, what happened in 2021 uh, early in the year was Winter Storm Uri, which hit Texas and really wreaked havoc on Texas, froze natural gas lines, disrupted, the entire chemical processing industry. And even though a lot of our products don't come directly from Texas, a lot of our customers, all of our suppliers' products, even back 2 or 3 tiers, uh, came from Texas. And so we had a ripple effect through our supply chain, the chemical processing world, that caused a lot of issues. As a matter of fact, my sourcing director she likes to say, I would take a pandemic anytime over an unexpected winter storm that blew away Texas, basically. So it's been a real challenge for us. And that global, that global span of chemical processing really is so deep and so wide. It impacts a lot of areas that people don't know that it does because it's just so far back in the supply chain. And we learned very quickly how to go back deeper and deeper in our supply chain to try to assess risk. And so for us, it was about diversification of our supply base the best we can. And when we can't do that, it's really about establishing very strong partnerships. That includes, the supply of products, but also with our logistic partners, trying to make sure we had, became the best shippers we could, right? So we were timely and prompt and tried to make our freight as attractive as we could and tried to make our footprint in the logistics world to be an attractive shipper of choice with these guys because they had finite resources. We wanted to be attractive to them. So it was across the board in all of our different areas. We had to focus on diversification, partnership, and then strengthening those partnerships as best we could.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting. I think me and Calissa were both pretty surprised by that, but it makes sense when you take through it of that you were actually impacted far more by this winter storm in Texas than the pandemic. And so I think a lot of people hear diversification and hear that topic, but don't necessarily know why that's valuable. So in your case, when you say diversifying your suppliers, does that mean you have suppliers that are offshore and coming through different routes, which means they're accessible to you if ports of Texas are not available? Does it also mean that you might have manufacturers local, so you don't even have to engage the ports? Like, what does diversification really mean for so many people that I think throw it around as a buzzword, but might not know how it impacts the value?
Yeah, we certainly saw, a lot of companies that had far-flung supply chains that had to go back and do a lot of nearshoring or reshoring of products because they couldn't get it out of China, and China had a lot of lockdowns and other stuff and put them in a very precarious position. We had a very small footprint outside of the U.S., and so we were able to manage that. Actually, one of our biggest challenges, we have a lot of suppliers in Italy, and they were really impacted by COVID. So we had to really work closely with them, but a lot of folks had to do some nearshoring efforts or reshoring efforts to bring product back in and develop those sources. We've got a lot of domestic sources function. Fortunately for us, we sort of had that as a philosophy and a vision for a while. So we didn't get caught up in low cost country. We got caught up in total cost of ownership. And that's a different way of looking at things and not just looking at the total or the piece part price and saying that's the end all and be all, but actually looking at the total cost of ownership. And that includes, the risk of, pandemics like this or political unrest or port stoppages, port blockages, all those risks. And of course, also risk of poor quality, risk of the length of supply chain. We saw that over and over again, right? Even a small ship turned sideways in the Suez Canal, right, disrupted global logistics for a large period of time because of the containers that need to be offloaded and reloaded and freight backed up everywhere, and it became a real mess for everybody. So we've really looked at those things and tried to make sure we understood the total cost of ownership and all the potential risks associated with those suppliers. And so we end up with a lot of domestic, really Midwestern sources that are just as competitive as a lot of the low-cost country ones when you take into consideration the entire cost of the supply chain. So that was an important decision for us and actually paid off very well for us during these two once in a lifetime, hopefully, events.
Yeah, right. That's the hope. And Calissa, I know you've worked with so many of our larger customers. Do you hear the topic of total cost of ownership come up very often, or elements of that, or what have you experienced when talking to our largest customers at Opendock?
No, actually, I have not heard of this concept, so I am curious to hear a little bit more. Like, what is the difference between that versus, is it just like a certain piece that you're looking at all of the individual pieces first, or how does
And
that
I
work?
think this is where we certainly experience parts of it, right? They'll tell us that they have a lot of detention costs, right, which flow into transportation costs, which become cost of ownership. So that's the part we get exposed to. But Tom, you seem to think of it more broadly, such as what is the risk of if we don't get it and have to go to an alternative supplier? What's the cost of us building our own warehouse and actually storing it, or buying these things in advance and holding inventory? What are some of those other key elements of total cost of ownership that, like, you don't think the everyday person might know about or consider when they're trying to build that out? Because I think it's easier said than done.
It is, and just like a lot of other things in life, if you do a make-buy decision, right, you can a lot of times massage those into being whatever you want them to be, right? So you have to be very pragmatic about what costs you associated with the supply. Very, very often, at least in my career, we've been tasked with what's called purchase price variance, right? I paid $1 last year, and this year I want to pay 90 cents or whatever, right? And so that's just the piece part price variance between this year and last year, or this last quarter and this quarter, whatever. So the question is, how can you, how can you assess the other costs that sometimes are intrinsic or soft costs that are not necessarily show up in the piece part price, but actually impact your total cost of doing business, right? And it shows up in the overheads or somewhere else. And that's what you got to kind of poke into and say, what's the cost of what's the landed cost, right? How much is it going to cost me to get it here? And is there a cost of storage? What's the risk of loss, right? You always hear about containers on ocean carriers getting lost. If they're top loaded, they might get lost or knocked overboard and you lose a whole container. That kind of stuff happens even today. And so there's a risk of loss there that you got to look at. Who's gonna absorb the cost of quality? You have something made overseas, and then you have to buy a container load of it, and you find out there's a problem with it. Now you've got all this product that's built that's bad, so you've got to do something about that. So we try to assess those risks and apply some cost to them. And those are some of the big ones. There's a lot of other ones that you can dig into and go deeper, but really, it's really about the cost of quality. It's the cost of delivery, landing cost, and then what's the cost of the supply chain? Do I have to build a warehouse? Do I have to carry more inventory to buffer myself from issues with the ports or issues with production or all the other things you can think of? So we try to build a model that reflects what we think the total cost of ownership is going to be, and then we compare it. And those costs also exist domestically to some degree or another. So you need to do apples to apples. You can't just pick and choose what you're going to measure for each supplier just because you want an outcome to work a certain way. You have to understand what you're assigning and what risk levels you're assigning to it. And then it becomes a decision for the business. But it at least provides everybody with a clear vision of what the potential cost of ownership could be. And then you can make an informed decision.
From a practical standpoint, is that just a crazy huge spreadsheet? Where do you track all this? How do you write this down? As a guy who's had to live in spreadsheets for much of his career, do you have a tool that helps you do this, or is this like the 10-year-old spreadsheet that's like, don't touch this? This has it all.
Well, I mean, I think there's a multitude of ways of going about it. I know there are software packages that will track this stuff. Cost of poor quality is something that gets tracked in a lot of quality systems today. So yeah, it could be a number of things, but typically it's going to be when you put together an RFQ or an RFP, you may ask these questions so that when you do it, you're making a decision on this total picture of what's going on versus just this person offered to sell it to me for $1. This person offered to sell me for 95 cents. and then you make a decision just based on solely that criteria. So typically when I put together, or my team puts together an RFP, we're asking those questions to ourselves and also to our suppliers. What's the length of supply chain here? How much are you going to produce? A lot of times, you get these companies that want to produce big runs of something to minimize their cost, but that also maximizes your exposure to quality issues and other things, right? So you have to ask those questions as well. What's your production lot sizes? There's a lot of things you can get into. Like I said, you can go as deep as you want to, but there's some basic things you need to understand just about the total cost of ownership that helps you make a better decision for the business. And not just when there's a pandemic or a winter storm Uri or a port blockage or COVID or whatever, just in general. So there's no one's going to be able to predict the COVID, right? But you can at least predict some
Right.
things that are more common. So.
Yeah. I'm curious too. I mean, we're talking very high level on a macro level, right? But I'm really curious more on the micro level of, let's say that you do have a shipment that is lost or damaged for some reason, or a huge storm that comes in and impacts your entire supply chain. What do you do? Like, I don't even understand where you even begin to solve for that problem immediately.
Well, the first thing you do is try to assess, are there other products available that will meet those needs that you can get your hands on, either domestically or internationally from your supplier? And then you got to start looking at expedited freight, right? Do you need to air it? Do you need to, it depends on how big it is and how much it weighs and a lot of other things, right, that you got to take into consideration. But let's just say it's a heavy casting, for example, you're going to have to put some on a boat, and then you're going to have to put some in the air, probably, if it's a critical requirement of the customer. And you got to balance that, right? So you just begin to find ways to, in my career, I have chartered DC-9s to fly product across the country, and so I've done those things, and it's not cheap, but sometimes it's a necessary thing that has to happen for whatever reason. It could be a quality issue, it could be a unforeseen demand, it could be any number of things that cause you to have to do that, and you make a business decision. This is what's going to cost. Here's what's going to cost if I don't do it. And then the business will, you give the business the information, and you'll help make a decision about what's in the best interest of the customer and ultimately the best interest of the business. So it's not fun.
And that's such a good example of total. Yeah, that's such a good example of total cost of ownership, right? That people don't think about. If X percentage of our shipments are poor quality or fall apart, here's what it costs us to go replace them in real time, right? We source another vendor, short term, premium cost. We have to put it on a plane, pay for expedited freight. All these costs are so much above and beyond. And now you can actually quantify it and say, on average, when we had a shipment go bad, this is what our cost to replace was in short term. So now you start factoring that in. You build like a really good example of total cost of ownership based on some historical data. And I think I've been to so many places where they want that methodology, but at the end of the day, we forget quickly. We don't store that information well. We rely on somebody to tribal knowledge, raise their hand and be like, remember that time that bad thing happened 4 years ago? But people are quick to forget. And so I love the way you're explaining it and talking about capturing and really building a system around that. I think that's something that people don't have a lot of experience and knowledge around. But I think also in that, you mentioned a phrase that I really like that me and Calissa found really interesting after we talked the first time, called shortening the supply chain. And sort of just want to get more of your perspective on what that means to you. I know people are really familiar with the terms offshoring, right? What does that mean? It's we go to another place far away from your own because you can get more competitive, whether it's wage, material costs, and you have that lower ownership. But we know the longer the supply chain, the more likely it is to break. And if it breaks, what does it cost? So when you say shortening the supply chain for your company, kind of what does that mean? What are some tactical things you look at to shorten your supply chain?
Well, I think there's a number of ways to go about it. One of the easiest ways to shorten a supply chain is to carry inventory, right? You carry inventory to buffer yourself. You make sure that inventory is viable. And so when you put it on the shelf, you know it's good. So you have a backup. That's one way to shorten your supply chain. That's taking into account any variability you might have in your demand or supply. You buffer that with inventory. The other one's physically shortening it, right? Having multiple suppliers close by that can manufacture the same products for you to the same level of quality. A little tougher to do, but can be done. And then the other one is really getting a supplier that's very agile, that can respond very quickly to your issues, whether they're close or far away, but they can respond quickly. And then you shore that up with some sort of expedited freight, or have them close by. I mean, an agile supplier that's very cost competitive and high quality close by is the unicorn, right? Everybody wants that, but they're out there. You just got to do your due diligence and find them. And once again, it's understanding what that total cost looks like. They may not be the cheapest piece part price, but in the end, they give you the most flexibility and the most ability to respond to unforeseen changes, whether that be demand changes or supply changes in the marketplace. So that's what I mean by shortening it. Lengthening it obviously means you've got a lot more stuff in the pipeline, and inventory is a piece of that, whether it be inventory in the country of production or inventory here in the U.S. It's all adds up into the cost of the supply chain.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you ever consider actually like being your own supplier? If you start to see that you don't have any unicorn suppliers around you, do you also take into consideration maybe we should just like build our own plant and build that piece that we need, or those products that we actually need?
Yes, I mean you do, but I mean obviously there's a couple of questions you have to ask as a business, right? One is, do you have the core competency to be that supplier, whatever it might be, right? Do you have the skills and talent to do that?
Good point.
not to mention the capital requirement, but you also, if you want to run an injection molding house, you better know how to do that, right? It's not something you can just walk in and learn. You need to have people who know what they're doing. So,
Right.
so I think, yes, you certainly do. You can't have more control over quality than what you have in quality delivery than inside your four walls, right? You ultimately control those things. And the delivery time is obviously very, very quick when you're your own supplier. But like I said, then it becomes a question of the business's, what's the business vision? Does it make sense? Can they actually do that? Is it a core competency that you want to develop or you actually have? And those are questions that have to be answered more holistically than just in the supply chain or in the logistics area. I mean, we can be part of that solution, but ultimately the business has to decide whether that's a vertical integration step they want to move towards.
This is why I love these conversations, right? We started at the fragility of the supply chain, and now we're legitimately talking about corporate strategy. Like, I've been fortunate to work at some other publicly traded companies, and these are the real conversations, right? Can we bring this in-house? Are we capable of that? If we're not, who do we have to hire to help build this out? Or what's the shortcut or the fastest path? M&A. We want to go buy someone who's good at that, bring them in-house. Yeah. And so these are real, like, true corporate and financial strategy questions to organize around. And it's awesome because it starts from the supply chain, right? That all started because what if we can't get the parts? What if we can't control the quality? What if it's too expensive? And then you start asking yourself, should we just own this whole thing? And I really appreciate your approach, Tom. I think a lot of people are quick to say, let's just do that. And then raising your hand, maybe we're not good at that. And that's okay. Like, let's just be honest about what we're good at and what we want to own, because I don't think enough businesses think like that. It's hard charging. We should just own it. But you also know the risks that come along with it. And I think it works really well too. It ties. You mentioned inventory and seeing it as a positive thing. And it's funny, the same number of inventory, pending on how the rest of the world looks, is good or bad. It can be the same number, but sometimes investors are like, why are you holding all this inventory? You should be deploying capital, which should have ROI, and we should be constantly running that. Yep. And then when times go bad, it's, why didn't you have more inventory to be prepared when something bad happens so you didn't hurt your customers? And so it feels like it's just funny. You always get to equilibrium, but you're never right. You're always wrong no matter what you're doing.
My very first professional job, I got trained by this man who had been pretty burned out. And his first comment to me was, you're never going to be right in supply chain. So just get used to that right off the bat. I was young, just out of school. So that was pretty impressionable on me. I'm like, well, that's a heck of a career choice I made. But I tell my team all the time, supply chain is one of those jobs when you do it right, no one notices, right? If they go to get something that's there, that's just the way it should be. But when you do it wrong, everybody knows how to do it better than you did it. No matter what you did, money quarterbacking is alive and well in the supply chain, because they will certainly tell you what you did wrong. And so it becomes one of those games where you're right. You can't ever be right, but you have to accept that being in supply chain. That at the end of the day, someone's going to know how to do it better than you did it, and in the heat of the moment, you made a decision that was the right one at the time. But looking back, it may not have been the best one. So.
And I like that outlook, and it's so true. Supply chain is definitely like I call it the sports official analogy. Refs for a basketball game or umps for a baseball game, if it's going well, you never know their name. It's thankless. You just have no clue they exist because everything's just working smoothly. And when you do know one of their names, chances are it's not for a good reason. No one's
Exactly.
like, there's that ref I love. Like they did something. And that's what supply chain is like. You just, when no one knows it, that's when you're doing your best, which is kind of a weird thing, right? It's hard to advance your career, talk about promotions when it's like, when I'm doing well, you should not even know I'm here.
Well, that's sort of the conversation I have with my supplier partners, right? They say, hey, we don't talk a lot. And that's a good thing, right? If I don't know your name, that means you're doing well.
Right. Yeah.
That's great.
So.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention, or I wanted to hear from you about a little bit, was you have quite the background of now you've had a supply chain in plumbing, commercial, the bedding space, and then you also worked at Polaris, a motorsports industry. So three very different things. And in our last few minutes, I think we were really just curious to hear, how are those things similar? Because supply chain is always supply chain to some extent. And then how are they very different?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think supply chain at its very basic level is pretty similar across whatever industry you're in, right? You have to buy things that are required at the best price for the best quality and the best delivery for the company, right? And so, and then ultimately you got to get that product to the customer. And how do you do that with the highest level of service, lowest cost to serve, and eventually, the most intelligent methodology you can get. So, I mean, there's a lot of similarity there. One of the big ones that's different is really the regulatory environment, right? Plumbing is a heavily regulated. Potable water is very heavily regulated. Bedding has its own set of regulations for the national fire safety, and then you've got Polaris that has a lot of interaction with the consumer products group, right, as far as safety of motorsports. And so there's a lot of regulatory stuff, but it's also the focus. Motorsports is a heavily engineered product. Bedding is engineered, but it's more about assembly and manufacturing and design. It's a lot of design work. And plumbing is kind of a mixture of those things. It's heavily engineered, but there's a lot of design and sort of concept about how to plumb better and how to be a better supplier. But there's a lot of commonality across those industries. In fact, I've been in a lot of industries: tools, hand tools, business to business type stuff in industrial spaces, toolboxes. I ran a toolbox plant for a while making toolboxes. So, just a variety of things. But ultimately, in the end of the day, it's about providing the best quality products to the customer on time at the best price, right? And so, how do we do that? We use our leverage in our manufacturing and our engineering and lean and manufacturing processes and getting the best quality products at the best price, and then ultimately transporting those products to the customer. And so there's a lot of commonality, and I think it's really is transferable. A lot of skills are transferable. There's a learning curve around the regulations and a learning curve around the scope and the size of the amount of parts you're dealing with. But ultimately, buying one widget is pretty much like buying another widget. I probably made a lot of
for
supply
sure.
chain
You mentioned
the regular. Sorry.
No, it's true though. There's so much similarity, but then you mentioned the regulatory components, and then again, I think people don't always clearly see those regulatory components, which makes sense, right? It's all the things that sometimes we have our gripes about regulation, but then I really do want the things controlling my water that I drink to be highly regulated and very
Absolutely.
safe for me. But understanding how that flows down to the supply chain level of, okay, what does this mean? Does it mean in the food space, for sure, you get into things like temperatures, materials, what can be imported? Like it really starts to get deep and highly involved in the supply chain and quality control. And I think that's something that we don't always connect, right? We hear a regulation and we think, okay, that's what it is. And all the ripple effects and how it really does impact supply chain. I thought that was really cool. It was something I completely hadn't thought of until you had brought it up on our prep call.
And does that also go in? Is that also taken into account when you think about the total cost of ownership as well? It's like all the regulations that go into
Yeah,
place.
it takes,
and
in my current job, it takes us a long time to move to new suppliers because of all the qualification required, and rightly so. Anything that's touching our water source needs to be very heavily controlled. So we can't just up and move. So there is some, some cost associated with changing suppliers. And, it becomes about partnership for a lot of it because we can't move as easily and we can't go and just pick up. A lot of businesses can just pick up and move. If you don't like what something's happening, you can find another partner and move very quickly. That's not the case in these heavily regulated industries. You just can't do that. So it's really important you have good, strong partnerships and really good technology looking out in the future about what's coming so you can be on the cutting edge of what's coming so you can start developing those relationships early on. And that's what we spend a lot of time doing is looking out in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you're opening a business, you think about kind of what's your moat, or what are the hurdles, what are the things you have to overcome to get in there. And in a highly regulatory environment, that reduces the number of players in there because that by itself is a pretty large hurdle, right? We have to figure out how to be compliant, which is usually costly, requires a lot of overhead and initial investment. And so because of that, it makes your supplier circle probably small comparatively, at least. And then you talk about relationships. Well, people say that a lot, and we hear it a lot in the trucking and logistics industry. And people will preach relationships, but ultimately there's 500,000 plus motor carriers. And so while I'll hear it communicated a lot, sometimes I don't always see it in practice because people think, well, I've got about 500,000 other people I can call. But in your world, that's much smaller. Maybe you have 5 to 10 people you can call, and that relationship better be strong. And even if you don't move forward to do business with, you still better have a good relationship because that's such a small world. Things can change quickly. And
Yep.
I just really like that highlight. And I don't think people think enough about that, of how those small niche worlds, you better be friends with everybody, even if you're not necessarily doing business together.
It's true. And even during this time frame, with our relationships with our carriers, it was important, as I said, to have that because there was a finite amount of carrier power in trucks and trailers available, right? So we had to make sure that we had good relationships because we made sure our products got picked up, and that relationship, those paid off for us. So it's even true when you have when you have a tremendous amount of choices, you still need to find the right partners. So that was important too. So I don't want to. Go ahead.
No, that's so good. That's the ROI we need to tell to everybody of, did you hear that? Tom said the relationship was worth it. There was an ROI to that relationship because when things got tough, there was value to it. Because so many times people think of the relationship when things are going good, but you really test a relationship when things aren't going well. And so you highlighting that, like, that's the story I want to tell everyone. There is value to maintaining that relationship, but when times are good, you may not see it as well. And when times are bad, the ROI of that becomes nearly infinite.
It really does, and we saw it over and over again across our entire supply chain. In logistics and warehousing was no different, right? The people that we treated well and that treated us well, we were good partners throughout the pandemic, and it paid off for both of us. So yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome. So, Tom, you've educated us on concepts like total cost of ownership, shortening the supply chain, realizing how fragile things are, a little bit difference between a motorbike, a bed, and some plumbing supplies on how their supply chain works. But really, they're also widgets and they're all the same. So we appreciate all that. Calissa, do you have any final questions or final thoughts for Tom before we take off?
No, I think this was really insightful, honestly. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Today,
I've
Tom.
enjoyed chatting with you guys.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Tom. We appreciate it. Have a good one.
Take care.
Opendock is the leading dock appointment scheduling software for warehouses. Trusted by some of the top shippers and 3PLs, Opendock helps you save time and money by empowering carriers to schedule their own dock appointments. There's a way to make dock scheduling easier for warehouses and for carriers. To learn more, visit opendock.com.
You've been listening to What's Up Doc, a look inside the warehousing world, brought to you by Opendock. If you like the show, please rate and review us, and keep connected by following the show on your favorite podcast app. If you have a topic or someone we should talk to, message Calissa Pollard or Jeff Booth on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for listening.